Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Should I proceed?
Go ahead, Bill.
All right, we're going ahead. I'm Billy Voight. Welcome to the Mid-Missouri Civil War Roundtable. We're coming to you from the Boone County Historical Society in Columbia, Missouri. It's September 15th. Tonight's presentation is the Battle of Iuka, Mississippi. And I'll ask my host here, are we good to go as far as you can tell, or?
We're going. Go.
We're going. All right. All right. Let's see. And a while ago, there we go. I'm going to review a little bit. This is actually about the third in a series of programs that I presented. About a year ago was part one of a three-part presentation. And we talked about President Grant's memoirs. We learned that he wrote these and they were published in 1885. Very shortly later, he passed away. And so we had a program on writing of his memoirs and all the situations that involved. And we learned that he did so because he needed the money to support his family. Part two of what I've done in this series was on May 19th, this past spring. And we talked about General Grant and the rewriting of history by Frank Barney, Professor Frank Barney. In that presentation, we examined Grant's use of the historical record to discredit General William Rosecrans. We also covered the withdrawal and subsequent pursuit of Confederates by Rosecrans after the Battle of Iuka. Tonight, we're going to actually look at the bombs and bullets of the Battle of Iuka. In part two, though, this past spring, we determined that Grant has colored, if not essentially rewritten, the historical record. Grant did not give Rosecrans credit he deserved for the Union Army victories at Iuka and Corinth. Grant did his best to discredit the victory Rosecrans won at Stones River. Grant failed to support Rosecrans during the Chickamauga campaign, unfairly removed him from his command of the Army of the Cumberland, and removed him again after Price's excursion into Missouri in the fall of 1864. There were at least, sadly to say, we learned 4 instances that Dr. Barney uncovered where evidence indicates Grant falsified the official War Department records. And Rosecrans was not the only general unfairly chastised by General Grant. Grant propagated exaggerations and falsehoods about fellow Generals Hooker, Thomas, and Gouverneur Warren, but not nearly to the level of his seeming hatred for William Rosecrans. The Battle of Iuka is generally regarded as the beginning of the Grant-Rosecrans feud, as it's sometimes referred to. Tonight's program will examine the actual Battle of Iuka, Mississippi, which occurred on September 19th, 1862. First, we'll attempt to provide some insight into the life of everyday soldiers at the time of Iuka. We'll briefly review the commanding officers, that'd be Rosecrans and Price, and we'll then review how the opposing armies came to clash in the then newly formed community of Iuka, Mississippi. We'll examine the fighting that took place. And lastly, I hope to present my views on why the Battle of Iuka represents the point in time for which the personal and professional relationships between Generals Grant and Rosecrans became forever broken. What you see there is a casualty report compiled by the Confederate Regimental Surgeon of Brigadier General Little's division. It's an actual casualty report showing the deaths and the wounded. And if you read it, it shows the people, the soldiers that had to be left by the road and so forth. It's a very interesting but sad historical document. That's from the museum that we visited in Tishomingo County, Mississippi. primary source material that I've used for this presentation, the top center and the top left are Frank Varney's, Professor Varney's books. The book on the upper right is very, very interesting. It's a diaries of Brigadier General Henry Little, a Confederate general that was killed in action at the Battle of Iuka. The bottom center is called The Darkest Days of the Wars, the Battles of Iuka and Corinth. And that is a classic in the field. It's by Peter Cozzens. I've also borrowed heavily from the book on the lower right. It's called Rosecrans Meets Price. That is by Kitchens. And that's pretty much on the order of a self-published book, but it's very good. It has a lot of diaries and that sort of thing from individual soldiers. The picture that I'm pointing to there is called Going into Battery. That's the 11th Ohio Battery at the Battle of Iuka, and we're going to talk a lot about that tonight. On being a soldier in 1862, first of all, that's a sketch of Iuka up in the upper right as it appeared in 1862. The summer of 1862 appears to have been intensely hot, even by Deep South standards. By June, thick layers of dust seemingly covered everything in North Mississippi. Rain had been scarce, creeks were empty, and wells had dried up. Even the Iuka Springs, normally visited by tourists, had gone dry. At Corinth, the huge concentration of soldiers and their animals had polluted the drinking water, reducing it unsafe. The air was poisoned by the exhalations of thousands of sinks and cesspools, as well as from the thousands of graves, men and animals. Fleas and body lice tormented Yankees and rebels equally. Dysentery was all pervasive and had no respect for position or rank. Union Generals Halleck, Pope, Sherman were all sick or quite unwell, as was likely stated in polite company. Confederate General Little was so sick with malaria he had to be transported around by ambulance. General Beauregard went on sick leave to Mobile and soon found himself deposed by President Davis, and his command turned over to General Bragg. On December 17th, only 2 days before the Battle of Iuka, General Grant himself said in a letter to his sister, I think she was back in St. Louis, but Grant said, I have not been very well for several weeks, but so much to do that I cannot get sick. And here's a spoiler alert. Most historians read that letter and we'll talk about this some tonight, but they don't really believe General Grant was referring to headache or stomach ache or anything like that. He was, some people think he was writing about being hungover. I would call attention to the historical marker that is in place in Iuka. It talks about the bloody clash of September 19th resulted from the attempt of General Rosecrans to expel General Price from Northeast Mississippi. In 2 hours, 1/3 of the men engaged in that conflict were casualties. The more I've looked into this, this battle is many times characterized as a Union victory, and I don't think it was. At best, it was a draw, but many Southerners view this as a Confederate victory. And after studying, I understand why they feel that way. Death from disease was common. The men moved around with a sort of dogged indifference, wrote one Union soldier. For a while, the dead were buried with customary honors of war. He continued. Finally, the sound of the 3 volleys became so depressing to the sick that it was by order discontinued. And they would normally give a three volley salute with their muskets to someone that had died. But that became, there were so many people dying and getting buried that it became so depressing the people on sick leave that the commanders ordered that discontinued. When Confederate forces evacuated Corinth on May 30th, Union forces garrisoned in and around Corinth, while the Confederate forces regrouped near Tupelo. Both armies lapsed into a period of relative inactivity over the summer. And this is at a grave for Confederate soldiers that buried at Iuka. On the Confederate side, near Tupelo, soldiers were being exposed to a rigorous training program and strict military discipline. A typical day's duty in one of Hebert's units was as follows, Hebert being the Confederate general. Every day's duty was very much like the duties of every other day, except there was some variation on Sunday. At Reveille, the soldiers had to promptly rise, dress, and hurry out the line for roll call. Then they would eat breakfast, the meal followed by guard duty for the next 24 hours, the guards walking their posts day and night, 2 hours on and 4 hours off. If you were not assigned to guard duty, you got to drill for 2 hours before noon. Next, the men would have dinner, followed by cleanup, gun cleaning, and dress parade at sundown. Finally, the men ate supper and had to be in bed at taps. On Sunday, there was no drill, but the men had to don all their armor and have a review, which, with the marching, halting, and waiting, usually lasted until about noon. And the part over on the right is about Douglas the camel. If you care to read that on YouTube, I'm not going to go over it tonight, but it's a camel that was traveling with the Confederates at that time. The camel was killed at Vicksburg. Meanwhile, on the Union side, General Rosecrans, with an estimated 35% of his men sick, decided to move his camp from Corinth to a more salubrious area. He chose an area about 5 miles south of Corinth known as Clear Creek. Here, there was a wide running stream of excellent water, many springs, and no swamps. But in spite of the abundant fresh water at Clear Creek, many Union soldiers still remained ill. According to Alonzo Brown of the 4th Minnesota, soldiers were frequently discouraged from going on sick call. Brown describes a regrettable case of his brother who died at the hands of an officer's upbraiding for going on sick call. Upon his brother Charles' return from sick call, Alonzo asked his brother if he received any medicine or advice. "No," said Charles, "I received nothing but abuse. I was abused like a dog and told that I was not sick, but playing off," meaning he was slacking off, reporting for sick leave only to escape his regular duties. "All our boys are abused to go there," said Charles. "I will not go back again. I'd rather die than go back to that sick call." The next morning, the Minnesota soldier was unconscious and only then seen by a doctor, whereupon he soon expired from what the doctor diagnosed as typhoid fever. Point being a soldier in 1862 was a very difficult duty. William Rosecrans, looking at the commanders at Iuka, William Rosecrans graduated from the Military Academy in 1842 in the same class as James Longstreet, Don Carlos Buell, Earl Van Dorn, and John Pope. While at the academy, he earned the nickname Rosie, or more often Old Rosie. After an uneventful 10-year Army career, Rosecrans resigned in 1854. At the outbreak of the war in 1861, he was in the kerosene business in Cincinnati. In June 1861, he became a brigadier general in the regular army and fought what then was Colonel Robert Lee in Western Virginia. He drove Lee out of the mountainous part of Virginia, where, if I can editorialize, I believe Colonel Lee found out that he was not quite as welcome in the mountains of Virginia as he was in the Piedmont and the Tidewater. In May of '62, Rosecrans found himself directing the left wing of John Pope's army in the slow movement from Shiloh to Corinth. That's after the Federal victory at the Battle of Shiloh, Tennessee. They went on a little bit further to Corinth. Rosecrans was then promoted to Pope's position, and Pope went to the Eastern Theater. September '62, Rosecrans commanded the Army of the Mississippi with about 40,000 men, stations at Jacinto and Clear Creek, Mississippi, and Cherokee Station, Alabama. Making this report, I came to the conclusion that in talking about General Rosecrans, it would be unwise to describe him without mentioning his reputation for having a contemptuous temperament, which was, quote, in a fault-finding mood at Iuka, according to General Sanborn. According to the historian Peter Cozzens, on the subject of temperament at least, Rosecrans himself was capable of writing official reports telling a different story than the behavior that he actually exhibited. And I found this, I guess that's a piece of iconography there with General Rosecrans on that white horse. And the only thing I could think of, where's your hat, General? You're out of uniform. All your troopers there behind you got their hats on. Where's yours? Continuing our discussion of the commanders, the Battle of Shiloh was fought April 6th and 7th, 1862. The next day, on April 8th, Confederate General Sterling Price, who did not fight at Shiloh, reluctantly resigned as commander of his Missouri troops and formally became a major general in the Confederate Army. July 21st, he assumed command of an area referred to as the District of the Tennessee, and that referring to the river. The District of the Tennessee, which included North Mississippi. His job included operating against the Union troops stationed at Corinth and posted along the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. And I have a personal comment. Although generally not considered an outstanding commander, to the everyday soldier, Price was highly regarded, and his men were unwavering in their loyalty to him and followed him with blind devotion in battle after battle. Soldiers referred to him by the affectionate sobriquet Old Pat. I suppose we could refer to the Battle of Iuka as the battle between Old Rosie and Old Pat. That's a Missouri Confederate battle flag you see there. That's in the museum at Corinth, which I highly recommend going to. That's from one of the Missouri Confederate infantry units. I believe it's the 6th Missouri Infantry at the museum in Corinth. General Price was given command of approximately 16,000 men plus some 40 pieces of artillery. His army consisted of 7 brigades formed into 2 divisions. Most of the Missouri Confederate troops were put into a division commanded by Price's most able junior commander, the highly regarded General Henry Little. The other division was commanded by General Dabney Maury and was composed of regiments from Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, and Mississippi. In addition, there was a separate cavalry brigade commanded by General Frank Armstrong. Confederate General Van Dorn was also stationed in the area in '62. His primary job at that time was to hold the line of the Mississippi River. The relationship between Price and Van Dorn was, and I got a bunch of question marks there. I was going to finish that research and didn't have time to do it. I don't know if Price and Van Dorn got along very well or not. At any rate, Van Dorn was ordered by Bragg to, quote, do all things deemed needful without awaiting instructions. Van Dorn and Old Pap were to operate separately, but to, quote, consult freely and to cooperate whenever possible. And I guess I'm full of personal opinions tonight. I have one on General Price. Over the course of his military career, Price's continual disregard for logistical support caused him many problems. And I I take that back to the war with Mexico. His excursions into Missouri, I don't think he was very capable in the area of logistics. That's a picture of Brigadier General Little, West Point class of 39, Mexican War. And he was killed at, he commanded at Pea Ridge, and he was killed at Battle of Iuka, which we're going to cover momentarily. If you haven't noticed already, I normally only study the Trans-Mississippi Theater, Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas primarily. But we have a lot of Missourians that went to Mississippi, and that drew my interest. So I've traced them over there to Iuka and Corinth area. So I've attempted to track the Missouri units, and we have 3 that I've identified on this map that were from the Union, and about 4 units that were on the part of the Confederacy. And this, we're going to talk about a lot of the Missouri troops that were there. Strength figures at Iuka. General Price had about 17,000 soldiers under his command. I think most of them were effectives, meaning they had a weapon of some sort, shoes to march in. But in the actual Battle of Iuka, Hebert's brigade, there was some 1,700, and Martin's brigade under Price, some 1,600. And we could round that up to something just south of 4,000 troops, Confederates at Iuka that actually fought in the battle. Rosecrans had 2 brigades also that fought, around 2,200 for General Sanborn's brigade and around the same number for General Sullivan's brigade. So overall, it actually did the fighting at the Battle of Iuka. I just ran in round numbers, approximately 8,000 soldiers, Battle of Iuka. General Ord in that area commanded some 6,000 troops, and Grant had 900 of Ord's men. So that was the troop strength at this time in northern or around Iuka. Again, only about, I say only, 8,000 soldiers shooting at each other is a lot. That's how many were involved at Iuka. Events leading up to the Battle of Iuka in 1862, coming from Missouri via Arkansas, Price's men arrived in Memphis on April 15th and traveled by train on the Memphis and Charleston Railroad to Corinth, where extensive breastworks had been constructed by General Beauregard vis-a-vis the siege that had occurred beginning the end of April. From Corinth, Price's men withdrew south to the safety of Tupelo. It was at this time that Price traveled to Richmond. General Sterling Price from Missouri, the Missourian, traveled to Richmond to meet with President Jefferson Davis and try to persuade Davis to send Price and his men back to Missouri. And I got to thinking about this. These were state guard troops. And if you're unfamiliar with that arrangement, you can almost think of it as National Guard, only they were state guard. And many of them, I've learned, consider themselves, their primary purpose was to guard the state of Missouri. And here they had been sent east to, even though it's still the Western Theater, or it is the Western Theater, they've been sent east across the Mississippi, and a lot of them had crops to plant back home, and they had families to take care of, and militia raiding their homes and so forth. And I get the feeling that a lot of the Missourians, especially being state guard troops, would rather go back and fight in Missouri. But anyway, Confederate President Jefferson Davis flat out denied Price's request to be transferred at that time back to Missouri. But this time period when they were in Corinth, when they first went to Corinth, is when Price went back to Virginia to talk to Davis. July, Federal General Halleck was called to Washington to become General in Chief, and General Grant was left in command of about 60,000 troops in the vicinity of Corinth and Memphis. The Federals first occupied Iuka on May 30th. On September 4th, Price dislodged the Federals and occupied Iuka. Union Colonel Robert Murphy abandoned Iuka, leaving large quantities of Federal supplies to be confiscated by the rebels. Price is under general orders from General Bragg to prevent Rosecrans from moving into Middle Tennessee and reinforcing General John Carlos Buell, which was garrisoning Nashville at that time. Grant, in September 16th, Grant sends Mower to reconnoiter. He sent him Fighting Joe Mower to Iuka to see what's going on over there. The Rebs had displaced the Union troops there, and Grant wanted to know what the situation was. Upon discovering Price's presence in Iuka, Grant determined to attack immediately. Fighting at Iuka began on the 19th. Although stopping the Federal advance on Iuka, Confederates abandoned the town the next morning along the unguarded Fulton Road to meet up with Van Dorn for an assault on Corinth, which occurred on October 3rd and 4th. That is to say, the Confederates took Iuka and then abandoned it to go Price, so Price could link up with Van Dorn. Desiring a more, this is when General Grant, when they took over and they expelled the Federal forces from Iuka. Desiring a more complete picture, Grant sent Fighting Joe Mower down a narrow road to investigate from going from Corinth to Iuka, which is a distance of about 30 miles. After cannonading and interrogating a Confederate deserter, Mower came back and reported that Price was in Iuka with a large body of forces, but that his intentions were unknown. Price may have been staging a join up with Braxton Bragg in Tennessee or even Kentucky. More likely, Price was wanting to attack Corinth in conjunction with Van Dorn, who had been secretly jockeying behind the scenes to become Price's commander, which in fact he succeeded in doing on the very morning of the Battle of Iuka, September 19th. It could have been that Price was like Grant at that particular point in time. It's likely that neither commander had an overarching idea what he wanted to do. Perhaps each was just there waiting for the other guy to make a move. In any regard, Grant became concerned and decided to immediately attack the Confederates. Here's a map I would like to call attention to. It's in the top center. You can see Corinth. It's oftentimes referred to as the crossroads of the Confederacy. On the upper right hand, we have the little town of Eastport. It's on the Tennessee River. It's a very significant port for commerce and military maneuvering and supplies and so forth on the Tennessee River. I would like to note going into Corinth, you have the Mobile and Ohio Railroad in a generally north-south trajectory, and a generally east-west trajectory. You have the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. So Corinth, as most of you I'm sure know, was a very significant area, base of operations for the Confederates. It was very important. You see the blue lines, that's the march of the Union forces from generally from Corinth over to Iuka. You can see, and you can see from leaving from Corinth over to Iuka, you have General Grant's and Ord, that is their line of march, but you see the other blue line beginning at Stanley and going east and then coming down to Jacinto and then over into the direction of Iuka. That was Rosecrans' line of march. The other significant thing to point out is the highest point in Mississippi was along Rosecrans' line of march. It's the most southern mountain in Appalachia. While it's only just a little south of 1,000 feet, I believe it's 950 or something like that feet above sea level. Keep in mind that if you're a soldier walking over hills like that, they can you would understand why they call them mountains. The point would be that Rosecrans, his line of march over to Iuka was over much more hilly and rough terrain than his contemporaries under General Grant, who basically rode the train to that town of Burnsville to within 6 miles from Iuka. But Rosecrans had to force march his troops I believe it was 15 miles or so. Also significant on this map is a place called Bryce's Crossroads, which does not play into this engagement. However, it would become important in June of 1864. I just pointed out that that is in the general vicinity. So at the top of the map is Tennessee. To the right of the map is Alabama. But most of the map is of Mississippi. It's something of a topographic map. It has contour elevations. If you can read it, bottom 600, 500, 400 feet or so. If you can read that, you would see that General Rosecrans had a much more hilly route to traverse than did General Grant. Rosecrans' 9,000 troops forced march 18 miles in the mud from Jacinto. The terrain was hilly. At Barnett's Crossroads, Rosecrans makes a command decision, choosing not to divide his forces. Ord's 6,000 troops took the train to Burnsville and had a relatively easy 6-mile march along the railroad tracks to get to Iuka the next day. Ord was to have been the hammer in what's called a hammer and anvil attack. The Confederates were in Iuka. Ord and Grant were to attack from the north. Rosecrans was to come in from the south. You see the red mark, the red lines represent Rosecrans soldiers. They come to a point where then they have to, going from west to east, then they have to kind of swerve to the northeast. There's a point where you see that green line. This is where a lot of criticism has been directed at General Rosecrans for not dividing his troops at that point, rather choosing to keep them together. There were a lot of good reasons for him keeping his troops together, as we will see, but this is a bone of contention in pretty much the whole battle, because the red line represents the route that the Confederates were allowed to escape. And the critique would be that Rosecrans did not close that line. We're going to see that he had a good reason for not doing so. Approaching from the southwest, Rosecrans is running behind schedule and is traversing over rough terrain. He's out of contact with his commander, that being General Grant, but he knows he's committing to attacking on September 19th. And the attack was to have begun in the morning. However, it didn't really get going. The attack didn't get going till 2 o'clock or so in the afternoon. The reason being that Rosecrans had such rough terrain and it was raining and that sort of thing. At any rate, well, I'd like to point out the 8 miles you see way over on the right is the Fulton Road, and that's the path where the Confederates escaped. It was 8 miles from there to over to where Rosecrans actually came down the Jacinto Road, and a lot of swamps and rough territory in there. And Rosecrans simply decided he was outnumbered already and he didn't want to split his forces. So that's what this map is designed to show. Despite extraordinary field conditions, it's probably more than fair to say that Rosecrans was committed to upholding his commitment to attack Price on the 19th at all costs. But he's also concerned that dividing his forces would risk being overrun by the Confederates, which outnumbers his own troop strength. An additional concern was the distance, that being the 8 miles that he would have his forces split up. With the benefit of hindsight, it's probably a good thing that Rosecrans kept his force together. Initial skirmishing began around noon on the 19th. By around 4 o'clock, the two armies were fully engaged. Each side committed 2 brigades, and at the height of the battle, fighting was extraordinarily vicious. As it turned out, Rosie probably made the correct decision. As with even keeping his forces together, he was nearly defeated by the very determined Confederates. What was really probably on his mind is, hey, if I can just come down the Barnett Road to the point of intersection with the Bay Springs Road, I can then split my forces, sending half down the Bay Road and the other half down the Barnett Road. If the plan works, we'll then occupy the Fulton Road and close off all the escape routes. But as we'll see, that plan didn't work. Right in the center where that arrow's pointing is right where those roads split, is where the Confederates came up, fully engaging Rosecrans' army. This map is a map that General Rosecrans presented in his testimony to a joint committee to investigate the conduct of the war in January of 1865. The red lines indicate what likely was to have been Rosecrans' preferred route. You notice the scale, it's a half a mile scale, it's scaled down on the right, so you can see where the red arrows end is where Iuka was, and back out to where the left center is where the battle occurred. So you can see it's roughly 1 mile, maybe a little over a mile from the town of Iuka to where the fighting occurred. That picture is of John Driscoll. He's a curator of the museum in Iuka, and he's standing at a gravesite. Anytime you look at a map of the Battle of Iuka, you can always pick out a cemetery pretty much right in the center of it. And that's a cemetery. There's certainly hundreds, and a cemetery wasn't just a military cemetery. It was there before the battle. There are a lot of graves right there. And that's what's left of it. But it was right in the center of the fighting. A timeline of events. 2:30, the skirmishing began. By 4:30, there was intense combat taking place. 4:30 to 5, General Little, Confederate General Little brings up reinforcements. The Confederates drive Sanborn back and seize the battery that we're going to be talking about. General Little is killed somewhere in this time frame. Hamilton, the Federals counterattack around between 5 and 6 o'clock. By nightfall, the battle is pretty well wound down. Rosecrans enters Iuka the next morning to find that Price is gone, and Rosecrans orders a pursuit. The fighting started around maybe 2:30 in the afternoon, and it lasted until dark. But about an hour and a half was very intense. Rosecrans' forces managed to come within 3 miles of Price's headquarters at Iuka without being detected. The first elements to come into battle contact with the Confederates were companies A, B, G, and I of the 26th Missouri Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Holman. And I have a note, as the battle raged on, Colonel Holman's conduct became very unbecoming that of an officer. He basically chickened out. Contemporary correspondent of the Mississippian newspaper wrote at that time that he didn't see how, with the woods full of Confederate cavalry, the Yankees could get so close to General Price's headquarters without his knowledge. Federal Major General C.S. Hamilton's division was the first to encounter the rapidly advancing Confederates. Of Hamilton's division, Sanborn's brigade was in front. Each soldier was supplied with 100 rounds of ammunition, 40 of which were carried in the individual's cartridge box. Rosecrans was riding with General Stanley about a mile to the rear of the head of his forward column when the fight commenced. Upon hearing the gunfire, Rosecrans quickly galloped forward along the clogged wagon road to the front. Price had anticipated the attack to come from the opposite direction, the west. Southern approach to Iuka had been left essentially unguarded. Price was correct. The federal plan had been ordered to attack first. When Grant changed this plan, he neglected to inform Rosecrans. Price had expected the attack to come from Grant and Ord from the vicinity of Burnsville. In response to Rosecrans' advance from the south, General Hebert's forces had to double time nearly 3 miles to a point a mile south of Iuka. To counter the Confederate advances, General Sanborn ordered up his battery, the 11th Ohio, commanded by Lieutenant Sears. This action was met by Lieutenant James Ferris of the Clark, Missouri Battery, who, along with the St. Louis Battery, had been sent to accompany General Hebert's Confederate brigade. I'm tracking Missouri units. Clark's battery had been formed late in 1861 at Lexington, Missouri. Its original founder, Private and later Captain Samuel Clark, was killed at Pea Ridge, ironically by a Union cannonball. At Iuka, the battery was likely using 2 6-pounder field guns and 2 12-pound howitzers. The informally named St. Louis Battery was formed near Osceola, Missouri in October of '61 by Missouri Confederates primarily from the St. Louis area. Battery was initially supplied with 3 6-pound smoothbore cannons and numbered 100 men at its 1862 muster in Memphis. Battery was twice captured and paroled during the Civil War. So these are 2 Confederate batteries from Missouri that had a prominent role in the Battle of Iuka. Clark's Battery and the St. Louis Artillery. At a summit of the second hill south of Iuka, about 1.25 miles away from Iuka, the Jacinto Road veered almost at right angles toward the east. It was here that the large forces of Unionists and rebels met. The initial action found a regiment of dismounted Texas 3rd Cavalry using fixed bayonets and pistols to drive into the Missouri's Union sharpshooters. This development was followed by Ferris's Confederate gunners placing their unlimbered guns on a commanding knoll. Soon Ferris was joined by his fellow Missourian, Henry Johnson, who commanded the 2nd section of Clark's battery. Charging their 2 guns with case shot and canister, the Missouri rebels poured deadly fire into Sanborn's still developing Union battle lines. At this initial point of the battle, Missourians were directly fighting Missourians, with both in the vanguard of the action at the Battle of Iuka. The guns of the 11th Ohio Battery became the bone of contention during the Battle of Iuka. Under Lieutenant Sears' command, the 11th Ohio maneuvered into position, and their 3-gun section was unlimbered. Soon their cannon became a vortex into which opposing lines were drawn. The attack followed counterattack in the smoky darkness. The 6 guns consisted of 2 12-pound howitzers, 2 smoothbore 6-pounders, and 2 rifled bronze 6-pounders of the James pattern. This section was reinforced by Sanborn's brigades consisting of soldiers from Iowa, Indiana, Minnesota, and the 25th Missouri, commanded by Colonel George Boomer, whom Sanborn gave discretionary authority to move to the relief of any point in the federal line that was strongly assailed. Sanborn's confidence in Colonel Boomer was well placed. His leadership would prove to be pivotal in the fight about to come. Eventually, all of these guns were captured by the Confederates. All the guns of the 11th Ohio were captured and dragged off the field by the 3rd Texas Dismounted Cavalry. Unfortunately for the Southerners, they had no spare horses. This is after the battle. They had no spare horses to pull them. So the Texans drove steel files into the torch holes and left spiked guns on the Jacinto Road, 100 yards from where they had been captured. Shell fire from the 11th Ohio proved so effective against the Confederates that General Hebert ordered a massive assault on the Yankee battery. Seeing this, the Ohioans changed from shell to double canisters, charges of double canister. Soon the Confederates were charging in numbers sure to overrun the Yankees, but the terrain began to work against the rebels as it was impossible for their artillery to fire without endangering their own troops, which is exactly what happened. There turned out there was a lot of friendly fire in this battle. Fierce hand-to-hand combat ensued. As his troops met unyielding resistance from the determined Yankees, General Price realized reinforcements were needed immediately. He sought his trusted division commander, General Henry Lee, for consultation. At around 5:45 p.m., the generals met at the base of a hill about 100 yards east of the Jacinto Road, very near the battle line. The two generals were mounted only a few feet apart. As Price was ordering Little to bring up two reinforcement brigades, a minie ball passed under General Price's arm and struck General Little, quote, squarely on the forehead. He died immediately. Although the reinforcements were eventually sent for, they never arrived until near dark, too late to do any good. Little's death so disheartened the men that Hubert doubted their will to fight. Little's last diary entry, remember he's had that little black book that I showed you at very first. He kept a diary every day, all through his career of the service. His last diary entry was made the morning of his death. He ended his diary with a notation that he felt the Army would soon leave Iuka and return to Baldwin or Jacinto, and he dreaded another night march, but that would be his last comment. Twin Magnolias is a beautiful home in Iuka where General Little was temporarily buried. He was buried that very night, but his body was later removed. He was a native of Maryland and who had a long, distinguished United States Army career and fought in the war in Mexico and so forth. But at the outset of the Civil War, it's always interesting to me, the professional soldiers from the border states, if they fight for the North or the South. And as did Robert Lee, Henry Little also chose to take up the Southern cause. Meanwhile, back at the 11th Ohio, as the battle reached a crescendo among the 8,000 combatants, the situation on the ridge was becoming a sickening confusion among the Federals. The fight was going bad for Sanborn's brigade. Colonel Sanborn saw the 48th Indiana collapse and became enraged. He galloped into the mass of fleeing soldiers and ordered them to stand and fight. When two soldiers near him refused, Sanborn drew his service revolver and shot them both dead on the spot. The situation deteriorated beyond repair when Lieutenant Sears, commander, the lieutenant in charge of the 11th Ohio, was shot from his horse. Efforts to safeguard any of the 11th's guns proved fruitless as replacement horses were shot down as fast as they were brought up. Soon, Colonel Boomer himself was shot through the left lung. Before he would remember, he was in charge of the 26th Missouri at this point. Before he was carried off, Boomer ordered his 4 companies on the ridge to retreat. Every time I do one of these programs, I find some new people that I really start to admire, and Colonel Boomer was one that I did not know about before. I'd like to tell his story, how he came to fight for the 26th Missouri. He was a native of Massachusetts. He did not go to college because of poor eyesight. Instead, he went to work, and he came west and was building bridges over the the Mississippi River. And when the war broke out, so he got some of his buddies, I guess it was, and they formed a company and said, well, we'll fight for you. And so that's how he became a part of the 26th Missouri. He was fluent in French. He played Bach on the piano. And he was just he distinguished himself after Iuka. He distinguished himself at Champion Hill. However, 6 days later, he was killed in the second day of fighting at Vicksburg. Took a bullet in the head. There's a monument to him at Vicksburg. One by one, the regiments supporting the 11th Ohio began to crumble under the withering Confederate fire. The defeat of Colonel Boomer's Missourians forced the 5th Iowa to concede the ridge to the 3rd Louisiana. Of the 162 Missourians who went into the fight, 21 were killed in action, 76 were missing and wounded. The Iowans fighting alongside the Missourians lost 217 men, nearly half of those engaged, and all of that within 75 minutes. As to the Confederates, Hebert and Martin's brigades fought the battle alone on behalf of Price's army, their 4,000 troops, and no rebel regiment broke ranks. To the contrary, every regiment of Hebert's brigade claimed to have charged all at once. Darkness put an end to the battle, and the men laid down their arms in the full expectation of renewing the fight early the next morning. What did the commanding generals do that night? General Price, who had taken lodging with his fellow Missourian, the ever-present Trustin Polk, was awakened shortly after midnight by General Hebert. The Creole, General Hebert was from Louisiana. He was said to have been Creole. He was inconsolable. His brigade had been cut to pieces, he stated. The death of General Little so disheartened his men that Hebert doubted their will to fight. Price was approached by all of his subordinate generals. Even, I believe, Van Dorn had a staff person there. Although Price was adamant to resume the fight in the morning, his generals all wanted to withdraw and link up with Van Dorn, as previously agreed to. Their wagons were already packed, loaded. They were going to withdraw from town the very next morning. As I said previously, Van Dorn had been promoted and was now Price's superior commander. So the Confederates had already planned to evacuate Iuka. But Price wanted to stay and fight. Price admitted to the prudence, and the withdrawal began at 3 a.m. General Rosecrans spent the night pacing in front of lines, speculating on his situation. He was out at the front lines. Among his chief unanswered questions, pardon this language, but he wanted to know where the hell was Grant. Grant was supposed to have attacked. He hadn't heard a word from him. He dispatched a message to Grant by courier over a long line of vedettes previously arranged prior to the battle. Rosecrans detached a reconnoitering party to search for a way to outflank Price in the morning. He also rotated his divisions of Hamilton and Stanley, thus putting fresh troops on the front lines. He also gave orders to General Stanley for the Federals to attack the Confederates with bayonets at sunrise. Not a shot was to be fired, ordered General Rosecrans. If the Rebs had withdrawn, Stanley was to give chase immediately. That's what happened. The legacy of the 11th Ohio Independent Light Artillery Battery is quite a legacy. The destruction of Colonel Boomer's 4 companies from the 26th Missouri also doomed the 11th Ohio. Several gunners of Sears' battery stood by their cannon to the very last, exhibiting a brand of courage that Lieutenant Sears conceded to be foolhardy. The tenacity of the Ohioans' defense stunned the soldiers of the Texas 3rd Dismounted Cavalry as well as 3rd Louisiana. The Ohio battery had gone into action 97 strong. Now 18 lay dead and 39 were wounded. Of the 54 cannoneers, 46 were hit by enemy fire. Of the battery's 80 horses, only 3 remained unhurt. A few of the Ohioans were taken prisoner. In an act of remarkable restraint, the Confederates not only spared their lives, but let them go as well. Explained a rebel eyewitness. Those Ohio battery boys had so much spunk that we took pity on the few who were left, but we let them go. Further on the 11th Ohio's legacy, Lieutenant Cyrus Sears, shown here many years later, was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism in action at the Battle of Iuka. His citation reads, although severely wounded, First Lieutenant Sears fought with his battery until the cannoneers and horses were nearly all killed, wounded. He was born in Meredith, New York. He entered the service as someone from back east, probably migrated west looking for new, better opportunities. But he entered service in Bucyrus, Ohio, and he's buried in Upper Sandusky, Ohio. And I have a note, this unit served in Syracuse, Tipton, Otterville, Boonville, and New Madrid, Missouri, prior to Fort Pillow and Pittsburgh, and I believe that's Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, before its participation in the Corinth and Iuka campaign. They ended service at Pine Bluff, Arkansas in October '64, where they were ordered home to be mustered out. There's a picture of Lieutenant Sears. The Confederate legacy of Iuka. The Yankee line of battle had been shattered. 4 of Union General Sanborn's 5 regiments had been routed and his battery captured. After 75 minutes of close combat, the ridge belonged to the rebels. Now was the time for Confederate reserves to pass front, sweep over the ridge, swallow up the remaining Federals, and complete the victory. Instead, a lull fell over the battlefield. What accounted for the sudden stop in the Southern attack? Darkness, perhaps? Heavy losses? Unknown enemy strength? Perhaps. 3 Southern regiments had borne the brunt of the battle. 3rd Louisiana, the 3rd Texas Dismounted Cavalry, and the 1st Texas Legion. Each regiment had lost about 100 men, including many officers. But more important than the loss of regimental commanders or men was the absence of a guiding hand. Among the dead, General Little. Aftermath of Iuka, according to Union Army Major Byers, 5th Iowa, Iuka was the fiercest little conflict of the war. Antietam, Gettysburg, the Wilderness could show nothing like it, he later wrote. Only the setting sun put an end to what part of the time was a hand-to-hand conflict. For hours, the blue and gray stood within 40 yards of each other and poured sheets of musketry. The firing was at close range, and the black powder smoke hung at about head level, such that the enemy's lines could only be distinguished by the flash of guns. There are approximately 475 killed in action at Iuka. This figure is about the same size as Wilson Creek, Missouri, although the figure for Iuka is likely underestimated. The fighting, although relatively brief and largely indecisive, was intensely savage. In later writings, some participants described their participation at Iuka as among the fiercest conflict of the war. It was particularly so with the 11th Ohio. One of the Louisianans said that in, quote, in less than 3 hours, out of the 238 men of his 3rd Louisiana who went into the fight, 115 were killed and wounded. And those are casualty rates approximately around 50%, which is, as you know, very high. The moon was nearly full and threw a strong light upon the pale and ghastly faces of the corpses that night. while it glanced and sparkled upon the polished gun barrels and bright sword bayonets of the enemy's guns, which lay scattered around, according to F. from Anderson of the 2nd Missouri. There's some controversies about this battle, and I'd like to discuss them briefly. There were good logistical reasons Rosecrans did not attack earlier in the day, but in attack, indeed, he did. He was supposed to have attacked around 8 o'clock. They didn't begin the engagement until about 2:30 or so in the afternoon. As we said, it was very wet conditions, and he had a hard march. Grant and Ord did not hold up their end of the deal. They did not attack at all. If Grant and Ord would have done what they were supposed to do, the situation would have been very different. An acoustical shadow apparently did prevent Ord from attacking, although heavy smoke from the battlefield was clearly visible in what perhaps can be most charitably be described as a careless moment in judgment. Generals Ord and Grant attributed the smoke from the battlefield as retreating Confederates. In other words, they were retreating and burning supplies so the Federals couldn't take control of them. The point would be Grant and Ord didn't even send out a reconnaissance patrol or anything to investigate that smoke. Rosecrans also of contention was the pursuit after the battle. Grant wrote that Rosecrans failed to engage in the pursuit, which is absolutely not the case. Rosecrans most certainly did pursue the retreating rebels, and he did so for many miles. The documentary evidence presented by Dr. Barney on that matter is very clear. Grant himself is the one that called off the pursuit. This is true for both Iuka and Corinth. And that's a marker where General Little fell. Let's talk about this acoustical shadow. It's important because it's used to explain why Generals Grant and Ord did not attack. Grant wrote that the wind was blowing hard in the wrong direction to hear the sound of the battle. The statement was supported by Ord, although by Ord's standards of duty, he thought Grant was an inept commander, as Ord had very little patience with incompetent officers, regardless of their rank. Most, but not all, contemporary letters and diaries from rank and file soldiers are supportive of Grant and Ord in not hearing the sounds of battle. However, August Schilling of the 1st Minnesota wrote that he and his battery mates heard, quote, the thunder of cannon from the south at 5 p.m. They only assumed that Rosecrans' column wasn't as lucky as they were. Colonel Dubois, who was guarding the Union lines from Jacinto to Renzi, heard gunfire 15 miles away to the west. Additionally, MacArthur's men guarding the railroad at Ord's extreme left heard the noise of battle. General Ross, division of Ord's command, saw a lot of smoke from the direction of Iuka. However, Ross attributed the smoke to the enemy's evacuation of Iuka. He reported that to Grant and Ord, and they accepted that. The most plausible explanation given by historians for the reason Grant and Ord didn't hear the sounds of Rosecrans' battle, didn't come to his aid, even though they were just a few miles away, the most plausible explanation: the rolling ground close to the fighting dissipated the breeze Ord's men felt, and the damp air on the battlefield deadened sounds beyond a mile or two. And I wrote a note to myself. Cozzens, the historian Cozzens, wrote that quote, and it's taken from the official record. So that was the official explanation. I've written a note to myself. Damp air doesn't deaden noise. If anything, it enhances it. If you've ever been down to a lake of the Ozarks, summertime, and there's no wind, you can hear people across the cove. The water amplifies the sound. I know that from being on the river a lot. Anyway, that was the official explanation. The historian Kitchens concludes that it does seem, quote, incredible that some noise of the fighting was not heard at positions only a few miles away, since the artillery firing was so heavy. Gone over an hour. Sorry about that. Some examples exist that give pause to the wind blowing theory. The night was cold and the dew fell heavy. Not a breath of air stirred. Voices carried easily. Snap of twigs could be heard and so forth. So there are many descriptions of smoke hanging over the battlefield so heavily that it obscured the combatants' vision. Smoke hung over the battlefield like a cloud, obscuring every object 10 feet off, said a Yankee defender. If smoke hung over the battlefield, why didn't the wind blow it away? General Little was buried in the middle of the night, not long after the battle. 7 individuals, his staff and so forth, was holding a lit candle, accompanying soldiers carrying Little's body to his grave. Our candles flickered in the darkness, sending out weird shadows, stated one of Little's staff people. Accounts exist of surgeons operating by candlelight in makeshift field hospitals. Nobody said anything about those candles blowing out. The wind simply wasn't blowing. Rosecrans medical director, Archibald Campbell, would that be Archie Campbell, reported that the night was calm and without a breath of air stirring, so that as the battle raged after nightfall, we were enabled to dress the wounded by candlelight as well as if we had been inside a house. So there are many indications that there was no wind blowing that night. How is that explained? When we look at from Google Earth, up in the upper right hand, you see the arrow pointing to the village of Iuka. Down in the left, number 2 is Rosecrans approach to Iuka. That's the Jacinto Road in red. Number 3 is where the battle was fought. Number 4 is Burnsville. That's where General Grant was at that night. Number 5 on the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, somewhere along there is where Voight's troops were. But the distance between where the battle was and all of this cannonading, all of this musket fire, to where General Grant's position is 6.83 miles. Admittedly, that's to the northwest, and the wind usually would be coming from that direction, but that's what the data show in terms of the distances, trying to account for an acoustical shadow. What was Grant doing while the battle raged? Only one message was sent all night long. The last message Rosecrans got from Grant was at 1:30 on the 19th. Rosecrans got no guidance from headquarters all night long. This is a critical gap of approximately 40 hours. Grant's whereabouts have not been explained. Burnsville, 6 miles from Iuka. In his memoirs, Grant said that he remained in Burnsville and communicated with my 2 wings by courier. He remained in Burnsville, all right, but he did not communicate with General Rosecrans at all. Yet this time period, almost 2 full days, Grant sent no messages to Rosecrans. He did send a message at the bottom bullet point, other than the message about Antietam. The only other messages sent by Grant at this time were 2 he sent to Halleck as updates on the situation. What the reference to Antietam is, the Confederates had just lost that battle, and Grant had taken upon himself to propose peace terms to General Price. In other words, if you've lost in Antietam, your Eastern forces are probably going to surrender. Do you want to surrender? Iuka, General Price. And of course, Price played that to the hilt. He knew that he would not be attacked by Grant as long as he was considering the peace terms. So Price just played that to the hilt and stalled for time. And Grant was His actions were inexplicable. Why did Grant come away from Iuka with such animosity towards Rosecrans? Perhaps the following questions will help answer that question. Perhaps the following quotations will help answer that question. Private Tompkins, riding home from Burnsville, quote, camp rumors had Grant drunk at headquarters during the battle. Captain William Stewart of the 11th Missouri, quote, wrote home to his family. At that time, General Grant was dead drunk and couldn't bring up his army. I was so mad when I first learned the facts that I could have shot Grant if I would have hung for it the very next minute. Coming from a captain in the United States Army, I give that some credence. In his 2008 award-winning biography of Grant, that was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, Professor Gene Edward Smith, who passed away in 2019, stated, and this is someone that's researched Grant as much as anyone, quote, the evidence is overwhelming that during the Vicksburg campaign, Grant occasionally fell off the wagon. Grant was a binge drinker. In a clinical sense, he may have been an alcoholic. He could go for months without a drink, but once he started, it was difficult for him to stop. Grant periodically backslid and went on a bender. But thanks to Rawlins' vigilance, some episodes were few and far between. General Rawlins, I believe, was his chief of staff. As a journalist who covered Grant's campaigns wrote, quote, this is a quote within a quote, this was wholly and solely the result of Rawlins' uncompromising attitude. In other words, General Rawlins was a teetotaler, and he always insisted that Grant not drink around him. Rollins himself once stated that drink negatively affected Grant's usual promptness of decisions and clearness in expressing yourself in writing. I have been studying this for 2 or 3 years. I don't know of any more authoritative sources I can consult than what I have. I've been giving General Grant the benefit of the doubt this time, but I've decided that this is no longer a riddle and a mystery inside an enigma. I'm sorry, but I think General Grant had a problem. The record of General Grant's involvement with alcohol is quite extensive, far beyond what has been shown here. Neither Rawlins nor Grant's wife, Julia, were with him during this time frame. In fact, as soon as the Battle of Iuka ended, Grant hopped a train and went back to St. Louis to be with Julia, even as the rebels were assembling to attack Corinth. Corinth, mind you, no less than Corinth, the crossroads of the South. Grant goes home on the train to get a back rub from Julia. I'm sorry. It's well demonstrated that Grant deeply loved his wife, Julia, and the children she bore him. I, meaning Billy Voight, concluded that as long as he was around Julia, the easier it was for him to stay sober at a time when his country most needed him. People, of course, should draw their own conclusions, but I have drawn mine. Rumors of Grant being drunk at the Battle of Iuka were pervasive, including publicly published reports such as Grant's hometown newspapers in Cincinnati. Rosecrans was not kind in his critique of Grant at Iuka. Not personally, not in his official reports. He was not kind to his superior. Rosecrans could be quite caustic. It's likely Grant attributed much of the drinking rumors to Rosecrans himself, or at least to Rosie's staff and wide circle of professional and personal friends and acquaintances. Even if Rosecrans had nothing to do with any of this, Grant's perception that Rosecrans was responsible was enough to have irreparably damaged their relationship. And I only have one more slide. This is the battle site of Iuka if you go there today. I'm sorry to have to say this, but I didn't want any of y'all going there and saying, well, Billy, you didn't tell me that the battlefield has been built over. But I would strongly encourage you to go there anyway. You can stand, for example, right in the very center of it and see the graveyard that I showed you earlier. You can take solace in knowing that you're standing in an area where all of these brave soldiers fought, where a Congressional Medal of Honor was won. In spite of this overbuild, there's plenty of things to see there, and you can get a feel for the lay of the land. This situation of overbuilding battlefield is by no means unique to Iuka, Mississippi. We have that in, for example, Westport, Missouri, and by no means should we blame these merchants. The very day I took these pictures, I think my wife went into Piggly Wiggly and bought some Diet Coke. I myself have a hard time finding Hardee's, and I love their mushroom switch burgers, so I went shop there. So we can't blame the merchants. They didn't build a highway. The state probably located that highway. If you look at it from Google Earth, you'll see it's right in the middle of the battlefield where that intersection is, right where the 11th Ohio stood. Please don't let that discourage you from visiting there. There's much to see and do. And thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. Anybody got a question?
Well, sorry for taking an hour and a half tonight, but I think we had, oh, thank you for Stacy for doing that. Let's see, we have anyone left? Mike, see you're there.
Anybody out in cyberspace? Got a question?
If you see this on YouTube in the future, be sure if you like our programming, give us a like. If you have any suggestions how we can improve things, please feel free to leave a comment.
Questions in the room? Questions on it? Go ahead.
One little thing, you mentioned howitzers, was that Clark's battery? They had the howitzers?
I'd have to go back to the slide.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I thought I wrote down that Clark had howitzers, and the St. Louis group had smooth bores.
The question was about a previous slide that I labeled the type of cannon that were part of the Confederate batteries, St. Louis battery and Clark's battery, I think. And I don't know without going back to looking. I'm still on my learning curve on all this. I've gotten to where when I do a report, I'm trying to learn more about munitions and that sort of thing. So that's why I put those on there. Yes.
Would it have made much of a difference if Rosecrans hadn't necessarily divided his forces, but had taken that other road approaching from the south to cut off the Confederate escape? Is that the route he was supposed to have taken?
Yeah, the original plan had called for covering all escape routes. Those were the two main ones. And as to the question would have made any difference, I think everything would have been futile if he would have tried to have taken the time to march the additional 8 miles down there that day. As it was, he was supposed to attacked at 8 o'clock in the morning. He didn't get there till like 2 in the afternoon, and it would have been dark if he would have tried to have done that anyway. Or he could have split his forces and gone ahead down the road that he did and began the attack while the other forces circled all the way down there and tried to catch up and block that. However, the accounts that I read said that it was a good thing that he did not do that. He was pretty much defeated the way it was, even with all of his forces intact. There were just too many logistics to have made that successful. That answers you.
Yeah.
Anything else? Not relating to Iuka. There's been a number of years since I've been in the area down there. And last time I was there was a project underway on the east side of Corinth to build a contraband site on the place where it was during the war. Has anything been done with that you know of, or?
The question was, at Corinth, was a contraband camp during the war, and it's where the people that had been enslaved, African American Black people, were rounded up and put there. I guess, not sure. And The question is, has that location been restored or anything
No.
done with it? And I heard talk about that when I visited Corinth, twice in 2 years. But however, I did not visit it myself. But I would conclude that yes, that has been made available for public to go visit that area. I just didn't do it.
That's good. That's a good thing to have.
Yeah.
Good example of it. Anything else? You shut us down?
Yeah, we done?
Sorry for being so long-winded,
That's all right. That's good stuff there.
but okay.